Welcome, guys. I'm Dr. Moringa from MNG Research Consultants. So in our workshop today, we're going to be talking about conceptualizing your research topic and title. Then we move on to talk about your research objectives and research questions, problem statement, and ultimately we'll discuss briefly on how to develop a concept map. So one key question that we need to ask ourselves is, what really is a research title and what really is a research topic? I'll tell you that there's a difference between a research title and a research topic. Why? You might need to ask. The title is mainly the words that houses the topic, whereas the topic is the subject matter that which we focus on. And this information is seldom not taught to young researchers, to emerging researchers, and honors and master students. But thank God we're here to assist you through that process. So let's get into it. Topic selection. Now you want to select your topic. And this process has been made easy by the use of AI technologies. You really don't need to select a topic these days. You just go on your ChatGPT or DeepSeek and say, generate for me a topic about whatever topic that you're interested in, and it generates that topic. But the downfall is there is no context. The chatbot doesn't know the context within which you want to conduct your study. So my advice is to emerging researchers, to young researchers, or first-time researchers is that before you get to the AI tools to generate a topic for you, there are key steps that you need to follow. And here are the steps that we are going to get into this section. So step number one in your topic selection process is that you need to understand the research process. What I mean by understanding the research process, I'm saying to you, you need to begin with a solid foundation where you review courses, handouts, instructions, and specific requirements. The purpose of this is that it will assist you to understand the research methodologies, the fieldwork options, and analysis methods that are available within your study. So you are a first-time researcher, you just registered for your honors, for your master's, or for your PhD, and they give you handouts, they give you headlines with handouts and etc. All those things that they offer you within your department or your field or your discipline. You need to familiarize yourself with these and start with the basic research knowledge and institutional requirements. Before you get to develop your topic, you need to understand the discipline in which you're registering. You might be registering in a PhD in psychology, media studies, and communication studies, in gender studies. The first core point is you need to familiarize yourself with the requirements of the discipline before you sit down to come up with a topic. This is very important and imperative. Secondly, you need to review past dissertations and theses. Just you have an idea of what you want to do. You are interested in understanding trauma among children. You are interested to understand cross-cultural counseling in multicultural settings. You are interested in the representation of women leaders. So that's what you're interested in. But for you to zoom in and hone into what you specifically want to do, you need to review the past PhDs and dissertations. And this is within your discipline and specifically within your universities. I understand most universities, they do have the research space where they upload previous and past dissertation and theses. Get to familiarize yourself with those. There is value of examination or graded recent dissertation that align with your study. There is a valuable source of them. You need to get to there and understand from your discipline. You can request those from your supervisor, the previous dissertations that they've supervised, so that you can understand your expectation. The good thing is that when you go through a published or a completed dissertation or a thesis, you're actually having a step ahead. You're starting from a step ahead because you are working on something that has passed or that has been approved and accepted. So you need to look at the key consideration. You need to look at the topics that are covered. You need to look at the originality. You need to look at the methodology and the literature review. I often say to most researchers, first-time researchers, you do not need to invent any methodology. You do not need to invent any literature review or any theory. Go and look what has been done before you set yourself to begin and to do your topic. Remember, we're talking about topic selection. So it is crucial for you to familiarize yourself with the university's expectations in terms of the structure and the format of from the beginning. That is very important and crucial. Then the third point, the third step that you need to look at is you need to examine academic literature. Start with coursework and assignment you excelled in. If you want to develop a topic, remember we want to develop a topic. So I'll say if you were doing your honors last year, previous year you were doing your honors or you did your masters in coursework, now you want to progress to your PhD, look at those subjects that intrigued you, that triggered your interest when you were doing them, or look at those assignments or the essays that you excelled in. That shows you that you are actually enjoying it and you actually have a strength in those areas. Don't want to try and do something new. Just continue from what you've been, what your strengths are. So you need now, when you've identified that this is my strength or this is the subject matter of my interest, what you need to do is you need to identify gaps and unanswered questions in the current literature. Understand, look at what has been covered, what has not been covered. And this is where Google Scholar comes in handy. You need to use Google Scholar and citation indices to explore relevant and high quality journal articles. This step is very relevant because you are not simply developing a topic from the blue, from nowhere. You're actually aligning your topic from what has been done, from the gaps that has been left in previous literature. So this step is very, very fundamental in your process of developing your topic. Now, the fourth step includes identifying potential research questions. Research questions are very important, right? These are just questions that you begin to ask. Remember, this is the process of conceptualization. So you need to be asking yourselves questions. Now you have identified and situated your study or your topic within the broader literature and the gaps that you have identified. Now you need to begin to ask questions. And the questions are, how are these things this way? Why are these things happening? How is this the case? What, how, where, and why? These are the questions. Remember, in the process of doing this, you need to be jotting down notes because these ideas, if you don't put them down, you might forget them. In that process, you might not have another chance to think the way you were thinking. But when you write them down, and the more you read and when you refer to those, you engage in the process of refining what you've already jotted down. So the fifth section involves now narrowing down and evaluating the topics. Now, this stage involves the criteria for evaluation. You're evaluating your topic, you're looking for the originality. Remember, in the process of developing a topic, you can have 4 or 5 topics that you have, right? Because you've been reading extensively, widely, and your thoughts are not so much structured. So now this is where you need to assess and evaluate each and every topic based on the criteria of originality, importance, and the availability of literature, the data requirements, the feasibility, and personal attraction. These aspects are very important. If it is not original, that it is plagiarized. If something that is not important, then why should we do it? If there is no available literature to back up and to support what you want to do, then it might be a problem for you when it comes to the time of developing the literature review. The data requirements, you need to ask yourself, where am I going to get the data? If there is no data available, now your research questions won't be answered. Then the feasibility is, remember, honors is 9 months, 1 year they say, a master's is 4 semesters. Right? A PhD is 8 semesters. So your study should be feasible enough to be conducted within that period of time. Your topic should capture the feasibility aspect to say, are you able to do this within the framework of time that you've been provided for? Then personal attraction is, are you personally attracted to this topic? If you're not personally attracted to this topic, then you risk changing these topics 6 times before you even submit it to the supervisor. So it's very important to be personally attracted to the topic. So the importance of narrowing down the topic now to top choices and seeking peer and expert feedback is very important. You need to sit down with your peers. You need to share your topic, your ideas with your supervisor. The challenge that most people face is that they do the process in isolation. They fear being judged. They don't want to share with your supervisor. And when the supervisor comments, or when a friend or a colleague comments on the topic, now they are afraid of being judged. They change the topic again. But sit down and engage with your supervisor, engage with your peers and your colleagues, and hear what they think before you rush to change the topic. Then the 6th stage now involves the finalization of your research topic. Right here, you need to commit to your chosen topic based on thorough evaluation and feedback. You need to be convinced that this topic meets the criteria. You need to be convinced you yourself, and you need to be able to defend your topic. Remember, when you have developed a topic, it will come a point where you need to defend your proposal and present your proposal to a panel. So this is where it matters. If you are yourself in your own comfort space are not able to defend your topic, you will risk the challenge of it being crushed, and you have to restart the topic. So be convinced that this is the topic that you want. I've seen more often, right, as a supervisor and as a student as well, people who've done their topics, you spend the first year not even doing the proposal. You're developing a topic, you change, you're developing a topic, your supervisor comment, you think you change, you meet somebody out there, you get interested about what they're talking, you change the topic. That shows a gap in what you're doing. It's either you haven't read, you haven't done your research, you're not reviewing past dissertations, you're not going through literature. All those exposes the gap, and your supervisor can pick it up. The moment you start changing topics, as a supervisor, I can tell that this was not grounded in literature. This was not grounded in the field within which the topic wants to be done. So it's very important to be yourself convinced that this topic is that which you want to pursue. Because remember, a single topic, you go with it for the next 4 years or 3 years. So it must be an interest for you. It must have personal attraction for you. The most fundamental and difficult aspect of developing a research proposal is identifying the correct and right objectives and questions for your honors, your masters, or your PhD. Even when you're doing your independent research, research objectives and questions are very important. And the reason why I'm saying they're important, they need to be solid. They need to be followed throughout the entire study. And if they are not solid and grounded and founded in literature, you will risk them collapse along the way. So let's talk about how to develop research objectives. So there are various steps in developing research objectives and questions for your study. The first thing that you need to do after you have identified a topic or you're developing your research title, you need to work on what we call the problem statement, the research problem. You need to clearly define what issue or the phenomenon you want to explore. So what do we mean by the problem? The problem is that which you identify to say, hold on, there is a problem here, and this problem requires us to interrogate. What is the problem? So the problem statement or the problem, normally you ask yourself, what is the problem? What do we know about the problem? Where is the problem happening? What causes the problem? What happens if we don't address the problem? When did the problem start? And what should we do about the problem? And who else has spoken about this problem or researched about this problem? So that's what you need to do to develop the problem, a comprehensive problem statement or research problem. Then after you've done that, you need to conduct a thorough review of existing research to identify gaps and frame your study within the context. Now, when you are doing research, you cannot run away from literature. You cannot run away from reading literature or from reviewing literature. At each and every stage, You need to make reference to what has been done so that you contextualize your study within the broader context of research that has been done. So you need also to define the purpose. You need to articulate the purpose of your research, focusing on understanding, describing, or interpreting aspects of the social world. You need to identify the specific key themes, based on your problem and your purpose. Now, what you need to do is to identify the themes or concepts you aim to explore. And when you identify these themes and concepts, this is what forms the basis of your objectives. Now, formulate your objectives. You need to draft specific, achievable objectives to explore these themes in depth. And you need to ensure that they are aligned with your study's purpose and with your research problem. Now, the greatest challenge that most people face is that when they're developing their research objectives is that they fail to be specific. But before we get there, let's talk about the do's when developing research objective. What should you do? Number one, you need to be specific and clear, because your objectives should be concise and specific to guide the focus of your research. Do not use vague research questions or research objectives. You need to ensure that they are feasible. I spoke about feasibility of the topic. Now we're talking about the feasibility of your research objectives. Make sure objectives are achievable within the scope of your resource and time frame. Time is very important when you're doing academic research. You don't have the whole world to do your research. You have 4 semesters, you have 2 semesters, you have 8 semesters. So you need to make sure that whatever objectives that you're pursuing, they are feasible to be completed within that specific time. So you need to align also your objectives with the research questions. Research questions and research objectives are the same thing. They need to speak to the same thing. What you say are your objectives, they need to be converted into your research questions. You need to be as flexible as possible. Be open to refining your objectives as you understand the topic better. Objectives are not rigid. They change over time. You can change them as you develop your proposal. You can change them as more information comes to you. You need to focus on value. Your objectives should aim to contribute meaningfully to the field of study that you're using. Lastly, I want to tell you that your objective should always use verbs. They should always be verbs: to explore, to examine, to investigate, to discuss. The moment you miss the verb there is no verb in your objective, then they are questionable as to what exactly do you seek to do, because objectives include doing words. What do you want to do, or what do you want to achieve? Now, let's talk about the don'ts when you are developing your research objectives. You need to avoid to be too broad. Avoid objectives that are too general, making them difficult for anybody to achieve or to measure. They need to be measurable. So you need to avoid to be too general. For example, you say, to examine the role of coaching among psychologists, right? Somebody will say, what about coaching? Where? How? Why? Who are those psychologists? Where? So you need to make sure that if you have a contest or a case study, you need to include it there and avoid complexities. The problem with most people, they think that for you to be having a good master's dissertation, a good PhD thesis, you need to come up with something that is never been done anyway, and then that leads to complexity. Don't make objectives too complex that they become unmanageable or unfocused, and don't overlook ethics. Ensure that your objectives do not lead to ethical concerns in your research methodology. You need to also avoid duplication. Make sure that there is no duplication, and each objective should offer a unique aspect of your research to explore. Don't ignore literature. Don't formulate objectives without considering existing research and literature gaps. You can come up with beautiful objectives, but if you are not grounding them in literature or make reference to the literature, you might generate or do a research that has been done already within the same context. Then what is novel about your study? There might not be need for that study because the knowledge that you seek to produce is already known. Now, there are what we call red flags or wrong research objectives. The issue of vagueness, the objectives that lack specific details, and misalignment between objectives and research questions and the purpose. Those are a red flag. We ask yourself, did you just generate them using ChatGPT or DeepSeek or any other AI tools? They are what we call unrealistic ambitions. Somebody wants to investigate the whole of South Africa in 2 semesters. That's unrealistic. Goals that cannot be achieved within the available resource. You want to interview 1,000 participants in a period of 2 semesters or 4 semesters. Who asked you, are you sure that you're going to be able to do this? 9 non-measurable objectives, objectives that cannot be measured or quantified. Those objectives are a red flag. Then over complexity, goals that are too complicated to be practical or clear. All these are red flags and you should avoid these. And for you to avoid these, make sure you're making reference to the literature. Make sure you engage with your supervisor. Developing research objectives and questions. Now, how do we come up to our questions? Remember, we're focusing on the research objectives. So the formula is simple. You need to convert your objectives to research questions, right? Read through or reflect on your objectives. Start by thoroughly understanding your objectives. Understand them and what they mean. Then identify the key concepts. For each objective, identify the central concept or theme. Then formulate open-ended questions. Convert these concepts into open-ended questions that seeks to explore, describe, understand, or explain the phenomenon of interest. You need to ensure that they are aligned to the research objectives and review for clarity. Read them and read them again. Don't just copy and paste. Make sure that the work you're submitting to your supervisor is good quality. Now, that's all for developing research questions and objectives. Before we close this session, let's just look briefly on how to develop a concept note for your master's or PhD. Remember, after you've done your topic, you have a title, you have your problem statement, you have your questions, you have your objectives, and all these are aligned. Now, you need to come up with a concept note. A concept note is different from a proposal because a concept note is a document that describes the intention of that which you want to study or investigate. So it's not in-depth. It could be maximum 5 pages. So this is for you to get going with your supervisor or for the purposes of applying. So convert that information that you've done into a concept note. And the concept note can be only 5 pages. Include what we call the title that you've developed, the objectives, the problem statement, and possibly the brief review of literature and a small methodology that you seek to involve. And when you've done that, you have your concept note and you can share that with your supervisor. So that's all for today. Friends, let's meet again in our next workshop where we'll be moving on to develop the research proposal. So this will be focusing in depth on the step-by-step of developing a research proposal. We'll be looking at different guidelines from different universities. I know the UT has a 2 PGA form. I know UKZN has an ethics form. I know VITS has their own and UJ has their own. So we'll touch briefly on all those as we familiarize ourselves. Just keep in touch with us from MNG. Thank you so much.